The private jet's leather seats stretched endlessly before me, each one empty except for the worn fabric chair in 12A, where a man sat hunched over his phone, his calloused hands trembling as he typed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuned in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had purchased every seat on this commercial flight to Seattle, all 180 of them, because I couldn't bear the thought of small talk or curious stares. But somehow, the airline had made an error. One passenger remained, and as I settled into my usual first-class cocoon, I couldn't help but notice the quiet desperation radiating from the stranger 6 rows ahead. His name was David Martinez, though I wouldn't learn that until later. What I saw first was a man who looked like he'd been awake for days, his construction worker's frame folded awkwardly into the narrow seat, a crumpled tissue in one hand, and his phone pressed against his ear with the other. The conversation was one-sided, pleading, something about insurance, about experimental treatments, about time running out. When he finally hung up, the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd experienced in my 42 years of carefully orchestrated solitude. I was Carl Brennan, CEO of Brennan Industries, worth more money than most small countries, and I was running away. Not from creditors or scandals or corporate takeovers, but from the suffocating weight of my own success. 3 weeks earlier, my personal assistant had scheduled my entire month down to the minute. Board meetings, charity galas, merger negotiations, all of it blending into the same monotonous gray that had defined my existence since Sarah died. My wife had been gone for 2 years, cancer taking her piece by piece while I threw myself into work, telling myself that building an empire was how I honored her memory. But lately, even that felt hollow. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, and I watched David through the gap between seats as he pulled out a small photograph. Even from my distance, I could see it was a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair and what looked like a hospital bracelet on his thin wrist. David's shoulders began to shake, and he pressed the photo against his chest like it could somehow bridge the distance between him and wherever that little boy was waiting. I had purchased this flight to escape human connection, to exist in the sterile bubble of wealth that had insulated me from real emotion for so long. I wanted silence, isolation, the familiar numbness that came with being untouchable. But watching this stranger's raw grief, I felt something crack inside my chest, a fissure in the armor I'd spent 2 years building. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, I wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or acquisition strategies. I was thinking about the photograph in David's hands and wondering what kind of father would board a plane alone while his child lay in some distant hospital bed. The engines roared to life, and as we lifted off into the gray Seattle sky, I realized this flight would be nothing like the escape I had planned. David Martinez had been working double shifts at the construction site for 3 months. His hands raw from concrete and steel, his back aching from 16-hour days that started before dawn and ended long after sunset. Every paycheck went straight to Seattle Children's Hospital, where his 8-year-old Miguel lay connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. The leukemia had come out of nowhere, transforming his healthy, soccer-obsessed boy into a pale shadow who could barely keep his eyes open during their daily phone calls. The experimental treatment in Germany offered hope, but the cost was astronomical. $200,000 for a chance, not even a guarantee. David had sold everything he owned, his truck, his tools, even his late wife's wedding ring. But it wasn't enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, Back to the story. The fundraising efforts at Miguel's school had raised $12,000, a generous gesture that felt like pocket change against the mountain of medical debt crushing his family. His mother-in-law, Rosa, had been caring for Miguel while David worked, her own health failing as she tried to be strong for both of them. When the doctors said Miguel had maybe 2 weeks before the window for treatment closed permanently, David had maxed out every credit card, borrowed against his future earnings, and scraped together enough for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He had no plan beyond getting to his son's bedside, no solution for the money they still needed, just the desperate hope that somehow being there would make a difference. The flight attendant had offered him peanuts twice, but his stomach was too knotted with anxiety to consider food. All he could think about was Miguel's voice on the phone that morning, so weak it was barely a whisper, asking if Daddy was coming home soon. Carl watched all of this unfold through stolen glances and overheard phone conversations, each detail adding weight to the growing realization that his carefully constructed world of isolation was about to collide with someone else's very real crisis. He'd spent the last 2 years avoiding exactly this kind of human messiness, the complicated emotions that came with caring about people beyond quarterly profit margins. But something about David's quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming despair reminded him of another hospital room, another bedside vigil, another desperate fight against time and fate that he'd ultimately lost. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Carl found himself doing something he hadn't done in months. He was paying attention to someone other than himself, and the feeling was both terrifying and strangely familiar, like muscle memory from a life he'd abandoned when grief became too heavy to carry. The turbulence hit 40 minutes into the flight, causing David's water bottle to slide across his tray table and crash to the floor. Carl watched him fumble to retrieve it, his movements clumsy with exhaustion, and before he could stop himself, he was walking down the aisle. The first-class cabin felt like a different universe from the cramped economy section, and as he approached row 12, David looked up with the startled expression of someone who'd been caught in private grief. "Excuse me," Carl said, his voice rougher than intended. "I couldn't help but notice you dropped this." He bent to pick up the empty bottle, though they both knew that wasn't really why he'd come. David's eyes were red-rimmed behind wire-frame glasses that had seen better days. "Thanks," he mumbled, accepting the bottle but not really looking at Carl. "Sorry if I was being too loud on the phone. I know first-class passengers probably don't want to hear about—" "You weren't loud," Carl interrupted, settling into the empty seat across the aisle without invitation. The proximity felt strange after months of maintaining careful distance from everyone around him. "I'm Carl." "David." The handshake was brief but firm, calluses meeting the soft skin of someone who'd never done manual labor. "Look, I appreciate the gesture, but you don't have to sit here. I'm sure you've got important business calls or whatever it is guys like you do on planes." Carl almost smiled at that. Guys like him. If David only knew how Carl had spent the last hour staring out the window, counting clouds like a child, anything to avoid opening his laptop and facing another day of meaningless meetings. "Actually, I was wondering about the photo you were holding earlier. Your son?" David's entire demeanor shifted, protective instincts flaring as his face softened. "Miguel. He's 8. The photograph appeared again, produced from David's wallet with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects. The boy in the picture had his father's dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief, despite the hospital setting visible in the background. This was taken 3 weeks ago, before he started the latest round of chemo. Carl studied the image, seeing past the medical equipment to the child's determined smile. "He looks like a fighter." "He was, I don't know anymore." David's voice cracked, and he quickly tucked the photo away, as if exposure to air might damage it further. "The doctors say we're running out of options. There's this treatment in Germany. Experimental stuff, but the cost." He laughed bitterly. "Let's just say it's not covered by construction worker insurance." The number hung unspoken between them, but Carl had heard enough of the phone conversations to piece together the magnitude of David's financial crisis. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million for someone making $15 an hour. Carl's watch cost more than David's annual salary, a fact that suddenly made him uncomfortable in ways he'd never experienced. "How long have you been fighting this?" Carl asked, genuinely curious about the timeline of someone else's tragedy for the first time in years. "Officially, 6 months, since diagnosis. But really?" David rubbed his eyes behind his glasses. "I've been fighting to keep that kid alive since the day he was born. His mother, my wife, Elena, she died in childbirth. Complications nobody saw coming. So it's been just me and Miguel since day one. 7 years of scraped knees and school plays and soccer practice, thinking I had it all figured out. Then this." Carl felt the familiar twist in his chest that came with stories of medical tragedy. The involuntary memory of Sarah's last months, when hope had gradually given way to acceptance, and then to the terrible quiet that followed. "I'm sorry. About your wife." "Thanks. Elena would have known what to do about all this. She was the smart one. Always had a plan. Me, I just show up and work harder, like that's gonna somehow fix cancer." David managed a weak smile. "Miguel keeps asking when I'm coming home, and I keep promising soon, but the truth is, I don't know if there's going to be a home to come back to. The medical bills, the time off work, the second mortgage I took out 6 months ago thinking the insurance would cover more than it did." The flight attendant approached with the beverage cart, her professional smile faltering slightly when she noticed Carl sitting in economy. He ordered 2 coffees without asking David's preference, a small gesture that felt both natural and foreign after so long avoiding spontaneous acts of consideration. "You mentioned Seattle Children's Hospital. That's where you're heading?" David nodded. "Miguel's been there for 2 weeks now. My mother-in-law, Rosa, flew out with him when the local doctors said they couldn't do anything more. She's been sending me videos, trying to keep his spirits up, but I can see he's getting worse. Kids aren't supposed to look that tired, you know? 8-year-olds should be bouncing off walls, not sleeping 20 hours a day." Carl accepted his coffee from the flight attendant, noting how David's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm cup. The exhaustion was bone deep, the kind that came from months of crisis management on no sleep and constant adrenaline. Carl recognized it from his own reflection during Sarah's illness, the hollow-eyed stranger who'd stared back at him from bathroom mirrors and hospital corridors. "The experimental treatment," Carl said carefully, "what exactly does it involve?" David's expression shifted to something between hope and desperation. "It's called CAR T-cell therapy. They take Miguel's immune cells, modify them in a lab to better fight the cancer, then put them back. The success rate for his type of leukemia is about 60%, which sounds terrible until you realize that's infinitely better than the 0% chance he has without it." "And it's only available in Germany?" "This particular variant, yeah. There's one doctor, Dr. Weber, in Munich, who's been pioneering the technique for pediatric cases. Miguel's oncologist thinks he'd be a perfect candidate, but getting him stable enough to travel, covering the treatment costs, the follow-up care—" David trailed off, staring into his coffee. "I've run the numbers 1,000 times. Even if I work every day for the next 10 years, even if I never spend another dollar on anything else, it's not enough." Carl found himself doing mental calculations, though not the kind David was struggling with. $200,000 was less than Carl spent on a single business dinner at the Michelin-starred restaurants where he entertained clients. It was a rounding error in his quarterly charitable donations, most of which went to organizations he'd never visited and causes he couldn't remember choosing. The stark contrast between their realities felt obscene. "You're going to Seattle to say goodbye," Carl said, the words coming out more blunt than he'd intended. David's composure finally cracked. "I'm going to be with my son. Whatever time he has left, wherever that is, I'm not missing another day. I'm already missed too much, working all those extra shifts, thinking I was doing the right thing by trying to earn money for his treatment. But what if I was wrong? What if he needed his dad there more than he needed the money?" The question hung in the recycled air between them, loaded with every parent's worst nightmare about priorities and timing and the terrible mathematics of love versus survival. Carl thought about his own calculations during Sarah's illness, the meetings he'd skipped and the ones he hadn't, the delicate balance between being present and providing, between hope and acceptance. "He knows you're trying to save him," Carl said finally. "That has to count for something." David wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed by his display of emotion in front of a stranger. "Sorry, you didn't sign up for this when you sat down. Rich guy like you probably has his own problems." Carl almost laughed at that. Rich guy problems. Stock prices and board meetings and the crushing loneliness of having everything except the one thing that mattered. "Actually, I was running away from my problems when I bought out this flight. Turns out they followed me anyway." "You bought out the whole flight?" David looked around the plane with new understanding. "That's why it's so empty. I wondered why they let me on when I booked so last minute." "Computer glitch," according to the gate agent, though now I'm wondering if it wasn't something else entirely. Carl studied David's face, seeing past the exhaustion to the fundamental decency that radiated from him like heat. This was what goodness looked like when stripped of pretense, when tested by circumstances that revealed character rather than hiding it. The plane began its descent toward Seattle, and Carl realized that for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't thinking about Sarah's absence or his own guilt or the empty house waiting for him in Manhattan. He was thinking about Miguel Martinez, a boy he'd never met, and his father's desperate race against time. He was thinking about the arbitrary cruelty of circumstance and the random distribution of resources and opportunity. Most of all, he was thinking about what it meant to have the power to change someone's story, and whether that power came with obligations he'd been ignoring his entire adult life. As they prepared for landing, Carl made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives, though neither man could have predicted how completely or how quickly everything would change. Seattle Children's Hospital smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Carl followed David through corridors lined with colorful murals that couldn't quite mask the underlying atmosphere of crisis and hope warring against each other in equal measure. He hadn't planned to accompany David from the airport, but when the taxi pulled up and David hesitated before getting in, something in his expression had made Carl cancel his own ride to the Four Seasons. "You don't have to come up," David said for the third time as they waited for the elevator. "Miguel gets nervous around strangers, and after everything he's been through—" "I understand," Carl replied, though he wasn't entirely sure why he'd insisted on coming this far. The hospital setting brought back memories he'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. There was something about David's quiet dignity that made Carl want to witness whatever happened next. "I'll wait in the family lounge if you'd prefer." The elevator doors opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with silver hair and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. She looked up from her phone and immediately broke into the first genuine smile Carl had seen all day. "David, mijo, you made it!" Rosa Martinez embraced her son-in-law with the fierce tenderness of someone who'd helped hold a family together through its darkest chapter. Carl stepped back, feeling like an intruder on their reunion, but David turned and gestured him forward. "Rosa, this is Carl. We met on the plane. Carl, this is Miguel's grandmother." Rosa's handshake was firm despite her small stature, her eyes taking in Carl's expensive suit and Italian leather shoes with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd worked as a house cleaner for wealthy families most of her adult life. "Thank you for bringing him safely," she said, though Carl suspected she was reading between lines he hadn't even realized he'd drawn. "How is he?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled. Rose's smile faltered. "Weaker today. The doctors want to discuss options tomorrow morning, but—" "David." She glanced at Carl uncertainly, then seemed to decide that privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Dr. Patterson said, "We need to start thinking about comfort care, making him as peaceful as possible for whatever time he has left." Carl watched David's face crumble and rebuild itself in the space of 3 seconds. The practiced emotional control of a parent who couldn't afford to fall apart in front of the people depending on him for strength. It was a skill Carl recognized from his own experience, though he'd never applied it with such devastating stakes. They walked down the hall together, passing rooms filled with the quiet heroism of families navigating medical catastrophes with whatever resources they could cobble together. Carl found himself cataloging details he'd never noticed during his own hospital vigils. The way parents slept in chairs that weren't designed for human bodies. The collection jars labeled with children's names and desperate pleas for donations. The bulletin boards covered with photos of young patients who'd either recovered or were memorialized in the past tense. Miguel's room was at the end of the corridor, and through the partially open door, Carl could see a small figure surrounded by machines and tubes and the technological apparatus of modern medicine's battle against biology. David paused at the threshold, gathering himself, and Carl realized he was witnessing something sacred in the moment before a father entered his child's presence. "Hey, champion," David said softly, his voice transforming into something warm and steady despite everything Carl had witnessed over the past few hours. "Daddy's here." The boy who turned toward them was a fragile version of the child in the photograph. His dark hair thin from chemotherapy, his eyes sunken but still bright with intelligence and something that looked remarkably like relief. "You came," Miguel whispered, and Carl had to turn away from the pure joy in those two words. "Of course I came. Did you think I'd miss seeing you?" David settled into the chair beside Miguel's bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent countless hours in that exact position. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Tired, but better now." Miguel's gaze shifted to Carl, who stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of his role in this intensely private moment. "Who's your friend?" David glanced back at Carl with an expression that suggested he was wondering the same thing. "This is Mr. Carl. We met on the airplane." "Are you a doctor?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the directness that seemed universal among children who'd spent too much time in medical settings. "No," Carl said, stepping closer to the bed. "I'm just someone who wanted to meet you." Miguel studied Carl with the unnerving perception of a child who'd learned to read adult faces for clues about his own prognosis. "Daddy says I might get to go to Germany for special medicine. Have you ever been to Germany?" The question caught Carl off guard. He'd been to Munich dozens of times for business, had stayed in five-star hotels and dined in restaurants that charged more for a single meal that most families spent on groceries in a month. But looking at Miguel's hopeful expression, those experiences felt both completely irrelevant and somehow shameful. "I have," Carl said carefully. "It's a beautiful place, very clean, excellent hospitals." "Will you tell me about it?" Miguel asked, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't idle curiosity, but a way of making an impossible dream feel more real through someone else's memories. Carl found himself sitting on the edge of the bed, describing the Christmas markets in Munich's Old Town, the way snow looked falling on medieval buildings, the sound of church bells echoing through cobblestone streets. He edited his descriptions carefully, focusing on details a child might find magical, rather than the business meetings and corporate dinners that had actually filled his time there. Miguel listened with the intense concentration of someone stockpiling experiences for an uncertain future. Rosa bustled around the room, straightening already straight blankets and adjusting flowers that didn't need adjusting, while David held his son's hand and watched Carl with an expression that suggested he was seeing something unexpected. "The doctor who might help you," Carl continued, "works in a part of Munich near a big park called the English Garden. There are people there who surf in the river even in winter." "Surf in a river?" Miguel's eyes widened. "That's crazy!" "Completely crazy," Carl agreed, surprised by how natural this felt. Talking to a child about adventures and possibilities instead of quarterly projections and market fluctuations. "But sometimes the craziest things are the most fun." A nurse appeared in the doorway, and Carl could see David's posture shift into the defensive alertness of a parent braced for bad news, but she only smiled and checked Miguel's IV line, adjusting medication drips with practiced efficiency. "How's our traveler doing?" she asked, addressing Miguel directly. "I heard your dad made it in from across the country." "He flew on an airplane with Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl's been to Germany, and he says they have river surfing." The nurse glanced at Carl with mild curiosity, taking in his expensive clothes in a setting where most visitors looked like they'd been wearing the same outfit for days. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Are you hungry? The kitchen made your favorite Jell-O." Miguel nodded weakly, and Carl watched David help Miguel with the simple task of eating, noting the careful way he supported Miguel's head, the patience with which he waited for each small spoonful to be managed. It was a masterclass in love made practical, in the thousand small ways parents adapted to circumstances they'd never imagined facing. "Mr. Carl," Miguel said between bites, "if I go to Germany, will you come visit me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, innocent and devastating in equal measure. Carl could feel David's eyes on him, could sense Rosa's careful attention, could practically hear the unspoken complexities underlying a child's simple request for continuity in an uncertain world. "I would be honored to visit you anywhere," Carl said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in recent memory. They spent the next hour in comfortable conversation, Miguel describing his favorite video games, while Carl found himself genuinely engaged in discussions about characters and strategies he'd never heard of. David shared stories about Miguel's soccer team, about the championship game they'd won just weeks before the diagnosis, about the trophy that sat on Miguel's dresser at home waiting for his return. Evening approached, Miguel's energy began to fade, but he fought sleep with the determination of a child who'd learned that unconsciousness might mean missing precious time with people he loved. Carl watched David sing a Spanish lullaby in a voice rough with exhaustion and emotion, watched Rosa adjust the blankets one more time, watched a family navigate the impossible mathematics of hope and acceptance. When Miguel finally succumbed to sleep, the three adults stood around his bed in a silence that felt both peaceful and loaded with unspoken questions. Carl realized he'd spent more time in this hospital room than he'd spent having genuine conversation with another human being in the past 6 months, and the contrast between this raw authenticity and his usual carefully orchestrated interactions was stark. "Thank you," David said quietly as they moved toward the hallway. "You didn't have to stay. But Miguel, he lit up when you talked about Germany. It's been weeks since I've seen him that engaged." Carl nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility settling on his shoulders like an unfamiliar coat. Outside the window, Seattle's skyline glittered with the casual extravagance of a city that continued functioning despite the private tragedies unfolding in its hospitals. He thought about his empty penthouse apartment, about the emails waiting in his inbox, about the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning that had seemed critically important 12 hours ago. "I'd like to help," Carl said, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. "With the treatment in Germany, with whatever you need." David's expression shifted through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope before settling into the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to trust in miracles. "That's generous, but You don't understand what you're offering. The cost, the logistics, the fact that it might not even work." "I understand more than you think," Carl replied, thinking of his own desperate calculations during Sarah's illness, the way love could make seemingly impossible things feel not just possible, but inevitable. "And I understand that Miguel deserves a chance." Rosa looked between them with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people's true intentions. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would a stranger want to help us?" It was a fair question, and Carl found himself grappling with motivations he hadn't fully examined. Part of it was guilt about the arbitrary distribution of wealth and opportunity. Part of it was recognition of something in David that reminded him of his own capacity for love and sacrifice. But mostly, he thought, it was Miguel's question about visiting Germany, the casual assumption that adults who cared about children followed through on their promises, that the world contained more kindness than cruelty. "Because I can," Carl said finally. "And because someone should." The call came at 3 in the morning, jolting Carl from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. His penthouse suite at the Four Seasons felt cavernous and cold as he fumbled for his phone, the Seattle skyline glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that suddenly seemed like barriers rather than views. "Carl?" David's voice was raw with panic. "I'm sorry to wake you, but Miguel, something's wrong. They're rushing him into surgery and I don't know what to do." Carl was already reaching for his clothes, the expensive Italian fabric feeling foreign against his skin as he dressed with mechanical precision. "What happened?" "Internal bleeding. The doctor said his counts dropped so fast they almost missed it. Rosa called me at the hotel and I got here as quick as I could, but they won't let me see him. They won't tell me anything except that they're trying to stabilize him for emergency surgery." David's words tumbled together in the breathless cadence of someone fighting against complete breakdown. "I'm on my way," Carl said, already moving toward the door. The elevator ride to the lobby felt endless, each floor marking time that Miguel might not have, and Carl found himself making bargains with a universe he'd stopped believing cared about individual suffering when Sarah died. The hospital at night was a different creature entirely, stripped of daytime optimism and laid bare in its essential function as a place where people fought death with whatever tools science could provide. Carl found David pacing the surgical waiting room like a caged animal, his construction worker's hands opening and closing repeatedly, as if searching for something solid to grip. Rosa sat in a corner chair, rosary beads moving through her fingers with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd learned to pray through crisis. She looked up when Carl entered, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten with recognition. It was the look of someone preparing for the worst while refusing to abandon hope entirely. "Any updates?" Carl asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside David. "Nothing. They said the surgery could take hours, maybe all night. His body is so weak from the chemo, and now this—" David's voice broke. "I keep thinking about all the time I wasted working those extra shifts instead of being with him. All those evenings I could have read him one more story, played one more game, just sat with him." Carl recognized the terrible mathematics of regret, the way crisis made every previous choice feel simultaneously crucial and meaningless. You were trying to save his life. Miguel knows that. Does he? Because right now it feels like I was just avoiding the truth. Maybe I was working so much because being at the hospital meant facing how sick he really is. Maybe I was being a coward. David slumped forward, his head in his hands. Rosa's been stronger than me through all of this. Helena would be ashamed of how I've handled everything. Rosa looked up from her prayers, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about loss and love. Helena would be proud of you, mijo. She would see a father who sold everything he owned trying to save their son. She would see a man who flew across the country because his boy needed him. Don't let fear make you forget who you are. The waiting room slowly filled with other families navigating their own medical emergencies, each group creating small islands of private crisis in the shared space. Carl watched them with new awareness, noting the way people supported each other through uncertainty, the quiet heroism of staying present when presence was all they had to offer. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, board members, investors who expected him to be available regardless of the hour or circumstances. 3 months ago, these communications would have felt urgent, would have pulled him into conference calls and emergency meetings that seemed to matter desperately at the time. Now, they felt like noise from a different planet, irrelevant to the only question that seemed important, whether an 8-year-old boy would survive the night. "Mr. Brennan," a voice behind him made Carl turn. A woman in an expensive suit stood at the waiting room entrance, her presence somehow managing to convey both deference and barely contained frustration. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, from your legal team. I need to speak with you privately." Carl glanced at David, who was staring at the surgical department doors with the intensity of someone willing them to open through sheer force of desire. "Whatever it is can wait." "I'm afraid it can't, sir. There's been a significant development regarding your recent financial commitments. The board has called an emergency meeting, and your presence is required immediately." The words hit Carl like cold water. He'd authorized the transfer of funds for Miguel's treatment that afternoon, $250,000 that represented safety nets and contingency plans, and the kind of financial cushion that allowed people like him to sleep peacefully at night. But he'd also bypassed several layers of corporate oversight, treating company resources as his personal checkbook in ways that would raise questions among people whose job it was to protect shareholders from exactly this kind of impulsive decision-making. "What kind of development?" Carl asked, though he suspected he already knew. Jennifer glanced meaningfully at David and Rosa, clearly uncomfortable discussing confidential business matters in front of strangers. "Perhaps we could step outside?" "No." Carl's voice carried a finality that surprised him. "If this is about the money for Miguel's treatment, then David has a right to hear it." David looked up sharply, suddenly alert to the undercurrents of a conversation he didn't fully understand. "Money for Miguel's treatment? What money?" Jennifer's professional composure cracked slightly. "Sir, the board has frozen all discretionary expenditures pending review. They're questioning the authorization protocols for large transfers, especially those made without proper documentation of charitable intent." The corporate euphemisms felt obscene in the hospital setting, reducing Miguel's life-or-death situation to questions of documentation and authorization protocols. Carl felt something cold and hard settling in his stomach as he began to understand the implications of what Jennifer was telling him. "Are you saying the payment has been stopped?" Carl asked. "The transfer was flagged by our internal control system. Given the size and the irregular nature of the authorization, the board felt it necessary to suspend the transaction until proper procedures could be followed. There are forms, documentation requirements, approval processes that must be observed." David was staring at Carl with growing comprehension and something that looked like betrayal. "You offered to pay for Miguel's treatment, but you can't actually access your own money?" "It's not that simple," Carl said, though he was beginning to realize that maybe it was exactly that simple. His wealth existed largely on paper, in stock holdings and corporate structures and trust funds that provided immense theoretical power while limiting his ability to act quickly on individual impulses of generosity. "The company has fiduciary responsibilities, oversight mechanisms." "The company?" Rosa's voice cut through the corporate jargon with the sharp edge of someone who'd cleaned enough executive offices to understand how these systems really worked. "You don't even control your own money?" The accusation hung in the recycled hospital air, exposing the gap between Carl's intentions and his actual capabilities. He thought about the afternoon's conversation with Dr. Weber's office in Munich, the way hope had crept into David's voice when Carl had assured him that financial considerations wouldn't be an obstacle. He thought about Miguel's question about visiting Germany, the casual trust in adult promises that now felt like a devastating weight of responsibility. "There are ways around this," Carl said, his mind racing through alternatives. "Personal accounts, liquidating assets, loans against holdings." "How long would that take?" David asked, and Carl could hear him trying to keep desperation out of his voice. Jennifer consulted her tablet with the efficiency of someone accustomed to putting timelines on other people's crises. "Given the amounts involved and the need for proper documentation, probably 6 to 8 weeks minimum, possibly longer if the board decides to conduct a full review of your recent decision-making patterns." 6 to 8 weeks. Carl looked at David's face and saw the calculation there, the terrible arithmetic of how long Miguel's deteriorating condition could wait for bureaucracy to run its course. Through the surgical department doors, machines were probably keeping an 8-year-old boy alive while his family waited for adults to figure out how to convert good intentions into actionable help. "This is about more than just the money, isn't it?" Carl asked Jennifer, reading between the lines of her careful corporate speak. "The board has expressed concerns about your recent behavior patterns, extended absences, unusual financial requests, association with individuals outside your typical social circles. There's discussion about whether you're mentally fit to continue making major corporate decisions."
The phrase "mentally fit" hit Carl like a physical blow. He thought about the past 2 years, the way grief had gradually isolated him from everyone and everything that had once felt important. He thought about board meetings he'd attended on autopilot, decisions he'd made without really caring about their consequences, the slow erosion of engagement that had left him functionally present but emotionally absent from his own life. Now, when he finally cared deeply about something again, when he'd found a purpose that felt meaningful beyond quarterly profit margins, the same systems that enabled his emotional detachment were being used to block his attempts at genuine human connection. "What are you recommending?" Carl asked. "Return to New York immediately. Attend the emergency board meeting. Demonstrate stability and sound judgment. Work within established channels to address your charitable interests through proper corporate foundations." Jennifer's tone suggested she was reciting from a script designed to manage wealthy individuals experiencing what the psychiatric community politely termed adjustment difficulties. Carl looked around the waiting room, at families holding each other together through medical crises they couldn't control, at David sitting with his head in his hands while his son fought for life behind surgical doors, at Rosa, whose prayers had carried them through hours of uncertainty. This was real in ways that board meetings and profit projections had never been. This mattered in ways that stock prices and market analyses never could. "No," Carl said quietly. "Sir?" "I said no. I'm not leaving. Miguel comes out of surgery, we figure out how to get him to Germany, and I deal with the board later." Jennifer's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine concern underneath. "Mr. Brennan, if you don't return immediately, there's a strong possibility the board will vote to remove you as CEO. Your grandfather's company, everything you've built, could be gone by Monday morning." The threat was real, Carl knew. Corporate succession plans existed precisely to handle situations where leadership was deemed unfit, and his recent behavior probably looked erratic to people who measured stability in quarterly reports rather than human connections. But as he watched David stand up at the approach of a surgeon in scrubs, as he saw Rosa clutch her rosary beads tighter, as he prepared to learn whether Miguel had survived the night, Carl realized that some things were worth more than the empire he'd inherited and spent his adult life maintaining. The surgeon's expression was carefully neutral, trained to reveal nothing until families were seated and prepared for whatever news he carried. But something in his posture, some subtle relaxation around his eyes, made Carl think that maybe, just maybe, Miguel Martinez would live to see Germany after all. "The surgery went better than we hoped," Dr. Martinez said, his tired smile breaking through the professional restraint he'd maintained for hours. "Miguel's stable, responsive, and asking for his father." David collapsed into Rosa's arms, months of carefully controlled fear finally finding release in desperate, grateful sobs. Carl stood quietly beside them, feeling something shift in his chest as he watched the family piece itself back together through sheer force of love and medical expertise. "When can we discuss Germany?" Carl asked as they walked toward Miguel's recovery room. "Mr. Brennan." Jennifer appeared at his elbow, her phone buzzing with what Carl assumed were increasingly urgent messages from his board. "The meeting starts in 6 hours. If you miss this flight, then I miss it," Carl said without turning around. Some things matter more than corporate politics. Miguel looked impossibly small in the recovery bed, but his eyes were clear when they entered the room. "Dad? Mr. Carl, did you bring me any river surfing stories?" Carl laughed, surprising himself with the sound. "I've got plenty more where those came from, champion. But first, how do you feel about taking a trip?" David's phone rang before Miguel could answer. The caller ID
showed Dr. Weber's office in Munich, and Carl watched hope and terror war across David's features as he accepted the call. "Yes, this is David Martinez. Yes, we're still interested. Tomorrow?" David's eyes widened. "But the money?" "I understand. Yes, I'll call you back." He hung up and stared at the phone like it contained impossible news. "Dr. Weber had a cancellation. He can see Miguel next week, but the treatment has to be paid in full before we travel." Carl's phone buzzed with a text from his personal banker. The asset liquidation he'd started during Miguel's surgery had cleared faster than expected. "Consider it handled," he said simply. Jennifer stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Brennan, please. This is your legacy we're talking about." Carl looked around the hospital room at David holding Miguel's hand, at Rosa arranging flowers with tears of relief streaming down her face, at an 8-year-old boy who'd survived the night and might now survive much longer. This felt like legacy too, but the kind measured in lives changed, rather than stock prices. "My grandfather built that company to help people," Carl told Jennifer. "If the board can't understand that I'm finally doing exactly what he would have wanted, then maybe I'm not the right person to run it anyway." 3 weeks later, Carl stood in the lobby of Munich Children's Hospital, watching Miguel navigate the corridors in a wheelchair decorated with racing stripes and butterfly stickers. The CART therapy was working better than anyone had dared hope, and Miguel's energy levels were returning daily. "The doctors say he can start physical therapy next week," David said, joining Carl by the window. "They think he might be strong enough to walk again by Christmas." Carl nodded, remembering his conversation with his former board that morning. They'd voted to remove him as CEO, but the company's stock had actually risen when news broke about his personal funding of Miguel's treatment. Public opinion, it seemed, valued compassion over corporate protocol. "Any regrets?" David asked. Carl watched Miguel show Rosa how to make his wheelchair spin in circles, their laughter echoing through the hospital corridor. "Ask me again when I'm living in a cardboard box," he said. "But right now, none at all." His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. 3 competing headhunter firms wanted to discuss CEO positions where his demonstrated values would be considered assets rather than liabilities. Apparently, there were other companies looking for leaders who understood that profit and purpose weren't mutually exclusive. "Mr. Carl," Miguel called from across the lobby, "come see what I learned." Carl walked over to where Miguel was demonstrating his wheelchair navigation skills and realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes the best business decisions were the ones that had nothing to do with business at all. 6 months later, Miguel Martinez took his first steps in 2 years across the playground of his elementary school, while his father, David, finished his evening shift as site supervisor for the new children's wing at Seattle Children's Hospital. Carl, now CEO of a medical device company focused on pediatric innovation, kept his promise to visit whenever he was in town. The empty seat next to David on that airplane had changed everything for all of them. Sometimes the most important journeys began not with destinations, but with the decision to not travel alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.